The smoke from the fireplace carried the bitter scent of burning paper and broken promises, and Winona Hartford watched through the frosted window as her stepmother fed the last of her father's letters into the flames. It was December 1878 in Taylor, Texas, and Winona had arrived at her stepmother's ranch just 3 weeks earlier, believing she would finally reconnect with the family she had been separated from during her years at the boarding school in St. Louis. Her father had died from pneumonia 6 months ago, leaving everything to his second wife, Margaret, a woman with a smile as cold as January frost and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they touched. Winona had received only one letter about his passing, written in Margaret's precise handwriting, devoid of any real sympathy or warmth. When Winona finally made the long journey home to Texas, she discovered that her father had written to her every month during her time away. Dozens of letters she had never received, all intercepted by Margaret, who claimed they would distract Winona from her studies. Now those precious letters were nothing but ash. Winona pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the December chill seep through, watching the orange flames devour the last tangible connection to the father she would never see again. Her throat tightened with unshed tears, but she refused to let Margaret see her cry. At 21 years old, Winona had learned to guard her heart carefully, though this betrayal cut deeper than any she had known. "You have no right to those letters," Margaret said from behind her, her voice sharp as a blade. "This is my house now, and everything in it belongs to me. Your father may have been sentimental, but sentiment does not pay the bills or keep a ranch running." Winona turned slowly, her green eyes meeting Margaret's cold blue ones. "Those letters were addressed to me. They were mine." "Nothing here is yours," Margaret replied, smoothing down her dark skirts with deliberate movements. "You may stay through the winter since the weather is too harsh for travel, but come spring, I expect you to find your own way. Perhaps you can find employment as a teacher or a seamstress in town. I have no use for another mouth to feed." The dismissal stung, but Winona held her head high. She had nowhere else to go, no other family who would take her in. Her mother had died when she was 7, and her father's relatives were scattered across the country, most of whom she had never met. The small inheritance her mother had left her had been spent on her education, leaving her with refined manners and a good education, but no means to support herself. That evening, Winona walked into Taylor to clear her head, the cold December air biting at her cheeks. The town was small but bustling, with wooden storefronts lining the main street and oil lamps beginning to flicker to life as dusk approached. She passed the general store, the saloon with its tinny piano music drifting through the doors, and the small church with its white steeple pointing toward the darkening sky. Everything felt foreign despite being the town she had grown up in. 7 years away had changed everything, or perhaps she was the one who had changed. She stopped at the post office, a small building squeezed between the bank and a dress shop. The postmaster, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from sorting letters as she entered. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked kindly. "I was wondering if there might be any letters for Winona Hartford," she said, though she knew it was foolish to hope. Who would write to her now that her father was gone? The postmaster checked his slots and shook his head. "Nothing today, I am afraid. But I will keep an eye out." Winona thanked him and turned to leave, fighting back the disappointment that settled in her chest like a stone. As she stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, she nearly collided with a tall figure coming around the corner. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could fall. "Pardon me, miss," a deep voice said. "I was not watching where I was going." Winona looked up into a pair of warm brown eyes set in a sun-weathered face. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that needed a trim, wearing a worn leather jacket and dusty boots. A cowboy, clearly, from one of the nearby ranches. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with an honest face and a concerned expression as he made sure she had regained her balance. "No harm done," Winona said, stepping back. "I should have been more careful." "You are shaking," he observed, his brow furrowing. "Are you all right?" It was only then that Winona realized her hands were trembling, whether from cold or emotion she could not say. "I am fine, thank you." He did not look convinced, but he tipped his hat politely. "Daniel Quinn, miss. I work at the Henderson Ranch just outside town. If you ever need anything, that is where you can find me." "Winona Hartford," she replied automatically, then watched as recognition flickered across his features. "Hartford? You must be Charles Hartford's daughter. I worked for your father before he passed. I am truly sorry for your loss. He was a good man, one of the best I have ever known." The unexpected kindness from a stranger threatened to undo the careful control Winona had maintained all day. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears away. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Daniel seemed to sense she was on the verge of breaking down, because he cleared his throat and changed the subject. "It is getting cold. Can I walk you back to wherever you are staying?" "I am staying at the Hartford Ranch with my stepmother," Winona said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "But I appreciate the offer." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, something that looked almost like understanding or perhaps sympathy. "Mrs. Margaret Hartford is your stepmother. You know her." "Everyone in Taylor knows her," Daniel said carefully. "She has a reputation for being difficult to work with. Your father was well loved in this town, but his widow is another matter entirely." Winona found herself appreciating his honesty. "She burned all my father's letters to me this afternoon. Every single one he wrote during my years at school. I never received any of them until today, and now they are gone forever." The words spilled out before she could stop them, and she felt immediately foolish for sharing such personal pain with a stranger. But Daniel's expression softened with genuine sympathy rather than pity. "That is cruel beyond measure," he said quietly. "Your father talked about you often. He was so proud of you, always waiting for letters from St. Louis and writing back immediately. I remember him at his desk in the evenings, working on those letters by lamplight." Fresh tears pricked at Winona's eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude mixed with sorrow. "I wish I had known. I thought he had forgotten about me." "Never," Daniel said firmly. "He spoke of you every chance he got. How smart you were, how much you had grown, how you reminded him of your mother." They stood in the growing darkness, the sounds of the town fading around them as other conversations seemed to fall away. Winona felt something shift in her chest, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. This cowboy, this stranger, had given her something precious without even realizing it, proof that her father had loved her, had thought of her, had not forgotten her despite the years and distance between them. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear it." Daniel shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain for such a solid, grounded man. "Miss Hartford, I know this may seem forward, but your father was kind to me when I needed work. He gave me a chance when others would not. If there is anything I can do to help you, I hope you will let me know." Winona smiled despite her sadness. "That is very generous, Mr. Quinn. Daniel, please. Then you must call me Winona." They parted ways as the first stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, and Winona walked back to the ranch with a lighter heart than she had expected to carry. When she arrived, Margaret was already in bed, and the house was dark and cold. Winona went to the small room that had once been hers as a child. now stripped of all personal touches and furnished with only the bare necessities. She lay awake for a long time, thinking about her father, about the burned letters, and about the kind cowboy with the honest brown eyes. The next morning, Winona woke to frost on the window and the sound of someone knocking at the front door. She dressed quickly in her simple gray dress and hurried downstairs, reaching the door before Margaret emerged from her bedroom. When she opened it, she found the postmaster standing on the porch, holding an envelope. "Letter for you, Miss Hartford," he said with a smile. "Came in this morning." Winona took the envelope with trembling fingers, staring at her name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "Thank you." After the postmaster left, she tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was dated that very morning, and as she read the words, her heart began to beat faster. "Dear Winona, your father once told me about the autumn you were 10 years old, when you found an injured hawk near the creek and insisted on nursing it back to health. He said you sat with that bird every day for 3 weeks, feeding it and talking to it, until finally it was strong enough to fly away. He said you cried when it left, but you were smiling through your tears because you knew you had done something good. He told me that story to explain what kind of daughter he had raised, someone with a fierce heart and gentle hands. I thought you should know that memory of you, since the letters that contained it are gone. There are more stories where this came from, if you would like to hear them. Your friend, Daniel Quinn." Winona read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. She remembered that hawk, remembered the fierce protectiveness she had felt for the injured creature, remembered her father's patient guidance as he taught her how to care for it. The memory had been buried under years of other experiences, but Daniel had brought it back to life with his words. Over the following days, more letters arrived. Each morning, the postmaster would appear at the Hartford ranch with a new envelope, and each letter contained another memory, another story her father had shared with Daniel during their conversations. Winona learned about her first day of school, when she had been so nervous she had refused to let go of her father's hand until he promised to be waiting outside when lessons ended. She read about the Christmas she was 12, when she had used her saved allowance to buy her father a new pipe because his old one had cracked. She discovered stories about her mother too, tender reminiscences her father had shared about the woman he had loved and lost. With each letter, Winona felt a piece of her broken heart begin to mend. The anger and grief over the burned letters did not disappear, but alongside those painful feelings grew something new: gratitude for the cowboy who had taken the time to restore what had been stolen from her. Daniel was giving her back her father's love, one memory at a time, and the gesture was so thoughtful and unexpected that Winona found herself thinking about him constantly. Margaret noticed the letters, of course. Nothing escaped her sharp eyes. One morning in late December, she snatched the latest envelope from Winona's hands before she could open it. "Who is writing to you every day?" Margaret demanded, her face flushed with suspicion and anger. "A friend," Winona said quietly, reaching for the letter. "Please give it back. A friend." Margaret's lips twisted into a sneer. "A young woman receiving daily letters from a man is scandalous. What will people think?" "I do not care what people think," Winona replied, her patience finally wearing thin. "You burned my father's letters, and now someone is kind enough to share the stories those letters contained. You have no right to interfere." "I have every right," Margaret snapped. "As long as you live under my roof, you will follow my rules. If this continues, I will make sure that postmaster knows not to deliver any more letters to this address." Winona felt a flash of panic. Those letters had become her lifeline, the only brightness in her cold existence at the ranch. "You cannot do that." "Watch me," Margaret said, but she threw the envelope at Winona's feet before stalking away. "And do not expect to eat dinner with me tonight. I am tired of looking at your ungrateful face." Winona picked up the letter with shaking hands and retreated to her room. She knew Margaret would make good on her threat, which meant she needed to find another solution. That afternoon, she bundled up against the cold and walked into town, heading straight for the Henderson Ranch on the far side of Taylor. The ranch was larger than she expected, with a sturdy barn, several corrals filled with horses, and a main house that looked warm and welcoming with smoke curling from its chimney. Winona found Daniel in one of the corrals, working with a young chestnut mare that seemed skittish and uncertain. He moved with quiet confidence, speaking softly to the horse as he guided it through its paces. When he spotted Winona standing by the fence, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Winona," he said, leading the mare to the fence line, "this is a pleasant surprise." "What brings you out here?" "I needed to thank you," she said, gripping the top rail of the fence. "For the letters. For everything you have written, you have given me back something precious that I thought was lost forever." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Your father's stories deserve to be shared. I am just glad I could remember them well enough to write them down. My stepmother threatened to stop the postmaster from delivering letters to the ranch," Winona said, her words coming out in a rush. "She thinks it is inappropriate for me to receive daily letters from a man. I was hoping that perhaps I could give you an address in town where the letters could be sent instead, or maybe I could come here to collect them." "She has no right to keep your mail from you," Daniel said, his jaw tightening with anger. "That is not just cruel, it is illegal." "I know, but she is the kind of woman who does not care about what is right, only about control." Daniel studied her for a long moment, and Winona found herself unable to look away from his steady brown eyes. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced in years, as though he could look past her carefully maintained composure and see the loneliness and longing underneath. "I have a better idea," he said finally. "Why do not you come here every day? You can collect the letters in person and we can talk. I have more stories to share, and I think your father would be happy knowing we have become friends." "I would like that very much," Winona said, surprised by how much she meant it. "But I do not want to interfere with your work." "You would not be interfering," Daniel assured her. "I usually take a break around mid-morning and again in the afternoon. Come by whenever you like. The ranch owner, Mr. Henderson, is a good man. He knew your father too, and I am sure he would not mind." And so a new pattern emerged. Every morning after Margaret left to run her errands in town, Winona would walk to the Henderson Ranch. Sometimes she arrived to find Daniel working with the horses, his hands gentle but firm as he trained them. Other times he would be mending fences or hauling feed, his shirt sleeves rolled up despite the winter cold, revealing strong forearms tanned from years in the sun. They would sit together in the barn or on the porch of the bunkhouse, and Daniel would tell her stories about her father while she listened with hungry attention. But as the days passed, their conversations began to expand beyond memories of Charles Hartford. Daniel told her about his own life, about growing up on a small farm in Tennessee and losing his parents to fever when he was 18. He spoke about heading west to find work, about learning the cowboy trade through trial and error, about the loneliness of drifting from ranch to ranch with no real home to call his own. Winona shared her experiences at boarding school, the homesickness that had consumed her first year away, the friends she had made and lost, the confusion of trying to become a refined young lady when all she wanted was to be back on her father's ranch. They discovered shared loves, a passion for reading, though books were scarce on the frontier, an appreciation for the raw beauty of Texas landscapes, a longing for the kind of stable, loving family neither of them had any more. Daniel made her laugh with stories about stubborn horses and ranch mishaps, and Winona found herself opening up in ways she had not allowed herself to do in years. The walls around her heart, built so carefully during her lonely years away, began to crumble in the face of Daniel's steady kindness and genuine interest. It was during one of these visits, in early January 1879, that Winona realized she was falling in love. They were sitting in the barn, taking shelter from a sudden cold rain that had swept across the plains. Daniel had draped his coat over her shoulders despite her protests, and they sat close together on a hay bale, their breath misting in the chilly air. He was telling her about a time her father had helped him break a particularly ornery stallion, but Winona found herself distracted by the way lamplight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the warmth in his eyes. "You are not listening," Daniel said, amusement coloring his voice. "I am sorry," Winona said, feeling her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "I was just thinking." "About what?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Winona knew she should deflect, should make some light comment and change the subject, but the words that came out were honest and unguarded. "About how grateful I am that you bumped into me that night outside the post office. About how different these past weeks would have been without your friendship." Daniel's expression softened, and he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I am grateful too. When I first saw you that night, you looked so lost and heartbroken. All I wanted was to help somehow, but I never expected to gain so much in return." "What have you gained?" Winona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You," he said simply. "Your company, your smiles, your trust." "Winona, I hope you know that these visits have become the best part of my days. I find myself watching the road, waiting for you to appear. And when you are here, everything feels right in a way it has not for a long time." Her heart was racing now, hope and fear tangling together in her chest. "Daniel, I feel the same way. But I have nothing to offer you. No home, no money, no prospects. My stepmother will turn me out in the spring, and I do not know where I will go or what I will do." "Then marry me," Daniel said, the words tumbling out with an urgency that surprised them both. "I know this is sudden, and I know we have only known each other for a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything. I am not a rich man, but I am a hard worker. I can provide for you, give you a home, a family. I can promise you will never be alone again." Winona stared at him, her mind reeling. Marriage had seemed like an impossibility, something that would never happen for her. She had resigned herself to a future of spinsterhood and employment as a governess or seamstress, always on the edges of other people's lives. But here was Daniel, offering her everything she had secretly longed for: love, security, a place to belong. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder with more conviction. "Yes, I will marry you." Daniel's face broke into a grin so wide and joyful that it transformed him completely. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the rain drummed against the barn roof. Winona pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and hay and something uniquely him, feeling safer and more wanted than she had in years. "I will talk to Mr. Henderson about building us a small house on the ranch property," Daniel said, speaking quickly as plans formed in his mind. "It will not be fancy, but it will be ours, and we can get married as soon as possible before your stepmother can cause trouble." "She will be furious," Winona said, though the thought brought more satisfaction than fear. "She wanted me gone, but she expected me to leave humiliated and alone, not married to a good man." "Let her be furious," Daniel said. "She has no claim on you, and once we are married, she cannot touch you." They made their plans in hushed, excited voices. Two people who had been lonely for too long finally finding their way home. Daniel would speak to Mr. Henderson and the local preacher, while Winona would pack her few belongings and prepare to leave the Hartford ranch for good. They decided to keep their engagement quiet until the arrangements were finalized, not wanting Margaret to interfere before everything was settled. Over the next week, Daniel worked tirelessly to prepare for their future together. Mr. Henderson, who had indeed known and respected Charles Hartford, was thrilled by the news and immediately offered Daniel a piece of land on the ranch where he could build a cabin. Several of the other cowboys volunteered their time to help with the construction, and soon a small but sturdy house began to take shape, with 2 rooms and a fireplace and windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to write letters to Winona, though now they were not just memories of her father but declarations of his own feelings and dreams for their future. He wrote about the home he was building, describing each detail so vividly that Winona could picture it perfectly. He wrote about the life they would have together, the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, the family they might raise if they were blessed with children. Each letter was a promise and a love song, and Winona treasured every word. On the 15th of January, everything was ready. The cabin was complete, the preacher was informed, and Daniel arrived at the Hartford ranch at sunrise to collect his bride. Winona had packed her few belongings the night before and was waiting by the door when she heard his wagon approaching. Her hands trembled with nervous excitement as she pulled on her coat and picked up her small trunk. Margaret appeared in the hallway, her face cold and suspicious. "Where do you think you are going?" "I am leaving," Winona said, holding her head high. "I am getting married today." "Married?" Margaret's voice was sharp with disbelief. "To whom?" "To me," Daniel said, stepping into the doorway. His presence seemed to fill the space, solid and protective. "I am Daniel Quinn, and Winona has agreed to be my wife. We are leaving now." Margaret's face flushed with anger. "You cannot do this." "She is still my responsibility until spring. And what kind of man proposes marriage after only a few weeks? You must be after her father's money." "My father left me nothing," Winona said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You made sure of that, so there is no money for Daniel to be after. He wants to marry me because he loves me, something you clearly cannot understand." "You are making a mistake," Margaret hissed. "Running off with a penniless cowboy will leave you destitute. You will come crawling back within a month." "I will never come back here," Winona said with absolute certainty. "This place stopped being my home the day you burned my father's letters. I am going somewhere I am wanted and loved, something this house has not been for a very long time." Daniel took her trunk and offered his arm to Winona. She took it gladly, and together they walked out of the Hartford ranch for the last time. As they drove away in Daniel's wagon, Winona did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the road ahead and the future waiting for her. The wedding was small and simple, held in the Taylor Church with Mr. Henderson and his wife as witnesses. The preacher's wife had brought wildflowers despite the winter cold, and they brightened the sanctuary with splashes of yellow and white. Winona wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Daniel said brought out the green in her eyes. Daniel wore clean trousers and a white shirt, his hair neatly combed, looking more nervous than Winona had ever seen him. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her husband, Winona answered without hesitation, "I do." And when Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, saved all these years for the right woman, Winona felt tears stream down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming joy and gratitude. This man, this good and honest man, had chosen her. He had seen her pain and loneliness, and had decided to spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt that way again. "I do," Daniel said in response to his own vows, his voice thick with emotion. "For as long as I live." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and sweet, full of promise and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling through tears, and the small gathering of witnesses applauded warmly. The Henderson Ranch became their home, and the little cabin Daniel had built became their sanctuary. It was modest, with just a bedroom and a main room that served as kitchen and living space, but Winona loved it more than any grand house. Daniel had carved their initials into the beam above the door, DQ and WQ, joined together. Inside, there was a bed he had built himself, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and shelves waiting to be filled with the life they would build together. That first night as husband and wife, they sat by the fire and talked until the early hours of morning. Daniel held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and told her about all the plans he had for their future. He wanted to save money to buy their own land someday, to build a larger ranch where they could raise cattle and horses. He wanted to give her everything she deserved to make up for all the years of loneliness and loss. "You have already given me everything I need," Winona said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You gave me back my father's love, and then you gave me your own. I do not need grand houses or wealth, I just need you." "You have me," Daniel promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Forever." The winter days passed in a haze of happiness. Winona learned the rhythms of ranch life, helping where she could and finding joy in the simple domesticity of caring for their home. She cooked meals on the small stove, learning through trial and error how to make bread and stew and biscuits. Daniel ate everything she made with enthusiasm, even the burned attempts, praising her efforts until she improved through practice. In the evenings, Daniel would come home tired and dusty from a day's work, but he always had energy for Winona. They would sit together and read by firelight. Daniel had surprised her with 2 books purchased from the general store, a novel and a book of poetry. Sometimes they would simply talk, sharing dreams and memories, building the foundation of their life together with words and laughter and stolen kisses. The other ranch hands accepted Winona warmly, charmed by her kindness and the obvious devotion between the newlyweds. The Henderson wife, Martha, became a friend and mentor, teaching Winona the practical skills she had missed during her years at boarding school. How to preserve food for winter, how to mend work clothes that took hard use, how to manage a household on limited means. Winona soaked up the knowledge gratefully, determined to be the kind of wife Daniel deserved. February brought warmer weather and the first hints of spring. Wildflowers began to appear on the plains, and the cattle grew restless with the changing season. Daniel worked long days preparing for calving season, but he never failed to write Winona a note before he left each morning, leaving it on the table where she would find it when she woke. The notes were shorter than his earlier letters, but no less precious, small reminders that he was thinking of her even when they were apart. "Good morning, my love. The coffee is still warm on the stove. I will be working in the south pasture today, but I will be home before sunset. I love you more than words can say. Your husband, Daniel." Winona saved every note, keeping them in a wooden box Daniel had made for her, a collection of his love letters that no one could ever burn or take away. Sometimes she would read through them when she was alone, marveling at how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had gone from grieving and lost to cherished and found, all because a kind cowboy had decided to write her a letter. In late March, Winona began to suspect she might be pregnant. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain before she raised Daniel's hopes. But when another week passed and her symptoms continued, she knew it was time to share the news. She waited until evening, until Daniel had finished his supper and was relaxing in the rocking chair, tired but content. "Daniel," she said, kneeling beside the chair and taking his hands in hers, "I have something to tell you." His expression immediately shifted to concern. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," Winona said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at her as though he could not quite process what she had said. Then his face transformed with joy so pure and intense that it took Winona's breath away. He pulled her up into his arms, holding her close but carefully, as though she were suddenly made of fragile glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "We are going to be parents. Are you happy?" Winona asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to describe what I am feeling," Daniel said, pulling back to look at her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have given me everything, Winona. A home, a purpose, and now a family. I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you and our child are safe and loved." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Winona bloomed with health, her face radiant despite the discomforts that came with carrying a child. Daniel was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worried that she was doing too much or pushing herself too hard. Winona found his concern endearing rather than stifling, understanding that it came from a place of deep love and the fear of losing what he held most precious. They spent the long summer evenings planning for the baby's arrival. Daniel built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it carefully until there were no rough edges that could harm delicate skin. Winona sewed baby clothes from soft fabric. Martha helped her select tiny gowns and blankets that seemed impossibly small. They debated names endlessly, wanting to choose something meaningful that would honor their past while looking toward the future. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him Charles, after your father," Daniel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Winona felt tears prick her eyes at the suggestion. He would have loved that. "And if it is a girl?" "You should choose," Daniel said. "What was your mother's name?" "Eleanor," Winona said softly. "Eleanor Rose." "Then Eleanor if it is a girl," Daniel agreed. "Though she will probably have your stubbornness and my terrible sense of direction, so we should prepare ourselves for trouble." Winona laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "I am not stubborn. You married me after knowing me for only a few weeks," Daniel pointed out with a grin. "That takes either stubbornness or insanity, and I prefer to think it was stubbornness." "It was love," Winona corrected, lacing her fingers through his. "I knew from the moment you started writing those letters that you were someone special, someone worth taking a chance on." "I am the one who took the chance," Daniel said, raising their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "I walked into the post office that night to mail a letter to my cousin, and I walked out having met the woman who would change my entire life. If that is not luck, I do not know what is." In September, as the Texas heat began to ease and autumn approached, Winona went into labor. Martha Henderson was there to help, along with the doctor from Taylor, and Daniel paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, terrified and helpless. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following morning, and there were moments when Winona wondered if she had the strength to continue. But then she would think of Daniel waiting outside, of the life they were building together, and she would find the will to push on. Finally, as the sun rose over the ranch on a beautiful September morning, a baby's cry pierced the air. Winona collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant as Martha cleaned the baby and wrapped it in a soft blanket. "You have a son," Martha said with a warm smile, placing the baby in Winona's arms. "A healthy, strong boy." Winona looked down at her son's tiny, perfect face and felt love so fierce and overwhelming that it stole her breath. He had a dusting of dark hair like his father and a determined set to his jaw even in sleep. He was beautiful and perfect, a miracle made of love and hope. "Bring Daniel in," Winona said to the doctor, who had been waiting by the door. "He needs to meet his son." Daniel entered the cabin tentatively, his face pale and his eyes wide with concern. But when he saw Winona sitting up in bed, tired but smiling, holding their baby, relief and joy washed over him in visible waves. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and sank to his knees beside the bed, staring at his son with wonder. "Is he all right? Are you all right?" Daniel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We are both fine," Winona assured him. "Would you like to hold him?" Daniel took his son with careful, reverent hands, cradling the baby against his chest as though he were the most precious thing in the world, and perhaps he was. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he looked at his son, and when he raised his eyes to meet Winona's, the love and gratitude there were almost too intense to bear. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift, for this life, for everything." "We made him together," Winona said, reaching out to touch her son's tiny hand. "Our son, Charles Daniel Quinn." "Charles," Daniel repeated, testing the name. The baby stirred at the sound of his voice, and Daniel's expression softened even further. "Hello, Charlie. I am your father, and I promise you will never doubt that you are loved. You will grow up knowing that every single day," and he kept that promise. Charles grew into a bright, curious child who was doted on by both his parents and the entire Henderson ranch. He learned to walk on sturdy legs, chasing after his father as Daniel worked with the horses, and learned to read sitting on his mother's lap by the fire. The cabin rang with laughter and love, a stark contrast to the cold silence of the Hartford ranch where Winona had once lived. Daniel continued to write to Winona, even though they now lived together and saw each other every day. Sometimes she would find notes tucked into her apron pocket or hidden in the pages of her books. Little love letters that said things like, "You are beautiful today," or "Thank you for the happiness you bring me," or simply, "I love you." Winona treasured them all, adding them to her growing collection in the wooden box. They heard news occasionally from town about Margaret Hartford. The ranch had fallen into disrepair under her management, and she had been forced to sell off most of the land to pay debts. Eventually, she left Taylor altogether, moving back east to live with relatives. Winona felt no satisfaction in her stepmother's misfortune, only a distant sadness for a woman who had been so consumed by bitterness that she had destroyed any chance at happiness. But Winona's life was too full of joy to dwell on the past. When Charles was 3 years old, she gave birth to a daughter, Elena Rose Quinn, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. 2 years after that came another son, James, with a sunny disposition and an adventurous spirit that kept his parents constantly vigilant. The little cabin that had once seemed spacious enough now burst at the seams with children and love. Daniel had worked hard and saved diligently, and by the time Charles was 7, they had enough money to buy their own land adjacent to the Henderson ranch. Daniel built a larger house there, with enough bedrooms for their growing family and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch their children play. It was everything he had promised Winona all those years ago, during their first night together as husband and wife. The new house had a special room that Daniel built just for Winona, a small study with a desk and shelves and a window that faced the sunrise. On the desk, He placed her wooden box full of his letters, hundreds of them now, accumulated over years of marriage. Above the desk, he hung a framed piece of paper, the very first letter he had written to her, about the injured hawk and her father's proud words. "So you never forget where we started," Daniel said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they stood in the doorway of her new study. "And so our children can someday read these and know the story of how their parents fell in love." Winona leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the security of his embrace. At 30 years old, she was far from the lost, grieving young woman who had watched her father's letters burn in a fireplace. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who had found her place in the world through love and perseverance. "Our story is not over yet," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "We have years ahead of us still, more letters to write, more memories to make." "Then I had better get more paper," Daniel said with a smile, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Because I intend to keep writing to you every day for the rest of our lives." And he did. Even as they grew older, as their children grew up and started families of their own, Daniel continued to write his daily notes to Winona. They evolved over the years, from love letters to observations about their grandchildren, to reflections on the life they had built together. Sometimes they were funny, sometimes poignant, but always they were filled with the steady, enduring love that had begun on a cold December night in Taylor, Texas, when a cowboy decided to give a grieving woman back her father's stories. Years later, when Charles was grown and preparing to marry his own sweetheart, he asked his father for advice about love and marriage. Daniel thought for a long moment, then led his son to Winona's study and showed him the wooden box full of letters. "Your mother's stepmother burned the letters her father wrote to her," Daniel explained. "She thought she could destroy their connection, erase the love between them, but love is not so easily destroyed. So I started writing new letters, giving your mother back the stories and memories that had been taken from her." "That is how you courted her?" Charles asked, picking up one of the old letters and reading it carefully. "That is how I showed her she mattered," Daniel corrected. "That she was worth the effort, worth the time, worth everything I had to give. Real love is not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It is about showing up every single day and choosing that person, over and over again. It is about finding ways to say I see you, I value you, I am here for you in both words and actions." "You still write to her," Charles said, noticing the fresh letter dated just that morning sitting on top of the pile. "Every day," Daniel confirmed. "Because every day I wake up grateful that she chose me, and I want to make sure she knows it." Charles carefully returned the letter to the box. "I hope I can love someone the way you love Mother." "You will," Daniel said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "You have a good heart, just like your mother, just like your grandfather Charles, whose stories I had the privilege of sharing. Love runs deep in this family, and it will continue to run deep in the generations to come." The wedding of Charles Quinn to his bride was a joyous occasion, held on the ranch that Daniel and Winona had built together. As Winona watched her eldest son exchange vows, she felt Daniel's hand slip into hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. She glanced at him and found him watching her rather than the ceremony, his brown eyes still filled with the same warmth and devotion that had captured her heart all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "About how grateful I am that I bumped into you outside the post office that night," Daniel whispered back. "About how one moment of fate changed the entire course of my life." "Mine too," Winona said, squeezing his hand. "Mine too." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and gold, Daniel and Winona Quinn stood together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, proof of the life they had built from ashes and hope. The letters that had started as a way to heal a broken heart had become the foundation of a love story that would be told and retold through generations. A reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love are found in the smallest gestures, repeated day after day, year after year. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Daniel sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. He wrote the date at the top, September 12, 1895, and then began to write, his handwriting as steady and sure as it had been 17 years earlier. My dearest Winona, today I watched our son marry the woman he loves, and I was reminded of the day I married you. Do you remember how nervous I was, how afraid that you might change your mind at the last moment? But you did not waver, not then and not in all the years since. You have been my partner, my love, my home. Thank you for saying yes to a cowboy who had nothing to offer but his heart and his determination to make you happy. Thank you for building this life with me, for giving me children and grandchildren, for filling my days with purpose and joy. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you even more tomorrow. Forever yours, Daniel. He left the letter on Winona's pillow, where she would find it when she came to bed. And later that night, when she did find it, she would read it with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face, marveling at how a man who worked with his hands all day could create such poetry with pen and paper. She would add it to the wooden box that now required a second, and even a third box to hold all the letters he had written her over the years. In the morning, she would wake to find Daniel already up, making coffee in the kitchen, and she would slip her arms around his waist and press her cheek against his back, not needing words to express what was in her heart. And he would turn and hold her close, and they would stand together in the quiet dawn, two people who had found each other in the darkness and built a life together in the light. This was the legacy of the burned letters and the cowboy who had decided to write new ones. Not just a love story, but a testament to the power of persistence, kindness, and the daily choice to show up for the people we love. In a time and place where life was hard and uncertain, where people struggled against harsh weather and harsher circumstances, Daniel and Winona Quinn had created something beautiful and enduring. They had proven that love could grow from the ashes of loss, that hope could be found in the smallest gestures, and that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion were the ones repeated quietly, faithfully, day after day after day. And if you were to visit that ranch even now, decades later, you might find an old wooden box full of yellowed letters, carefully preserved by generations who understood their value. You might read those letters and learn about a young woman whose stepmother tried to steal her father's love, and about a cowboy who gave it back to her, one memory at a time. You might discover that the greatest love stories are not always the ones that happen in an instant, but the ones that unfold slowly, deliberately, built line by line and letter by letter, until they become something that can never be destroyed or forgotten. This is how Daniel and Winona Quinn loved each other, from that cold December night in Taylor, Texas, until the end of their days and beyond, living proof that some loves are simply meant to be, and that when you find that love, you hold on to it with everything you have. You show up every day. You write the letters. You choose each other, over and over again, building a life and a legacy that will last for generations. Their story became legend in Taylor, passed down through their children and grandchildren, shared with neighbors and friends until it took on the quality of myth. But it was not a myth. It was real as the wooden boxes full of letters, as real as the house they built together, as real as the love that sustained them through all the joys and sorrows that life brought their way. And somewhere, perhaps, Charles Hartford looked down from wherever the dead go and smiled to see that his daughter had found the happiness he had always wanted for her. He saw that the love he had expressed in those burned letters had not been lost after all, but had been reborn in the words of a cowboy who understood that love is not just a feeling but an action, a choice, a daily commitment to showing up and saying, "You matter to me," in every way possible. This is the story of how love saved Winona Hartford, and how she saved Daniel Quinn in return, two broken pieces finding each other and becoming whole. This is the story of letters burned and letters written, of pain transformed into joy, of endings that became beginnings. This is the story of Daniel and Winona Quinn, and it is a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth celebrating for all the years to come.